Great. I see the numbers rising quickly. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrea Durkin. I'm the current president of Women in International Trade. Welcome to our event today entitled U.S.-Canada Trade on the Ground at the Entry Points. I mentioned that to make sure you know you're in the right place. I know there are a lot of webinars today. Thank you so much for joining. We have a lot of people on the call. We're so appreciative of the level of interest here. Look, for me, I'll tell you this, border operations and issues on the border are not something that I typically dealt with in my career as a negotiator. So I'm personally very keen to find opportunities to bring the policy community together with practitioners in the field, because we really need to always ground truth what's happening in trade and how trade agreements are actually working, what it's like for the traders themselves. And personally, I've always been completely fascinated with the statistic that at least pre-COVID, about $2 billion worth of goods and services are crossing just the US-Canada border every day, which I think is an amazing number and really makes me appreciate the women we're going to hear from who help facilitate that level of trade. Before we get started, I just want to thank NASCO for partnering with WIT to present. We're going to do 3 of these events in July on related themes. And honestly, if you don't know NASCO, you need to. NASCO is a lean but highly, highly effective organization. It's been around for 25 years, and it is unique. People throw that word around a lot, but it is truly unique. It is grassroots. It is trinational in its membership, in its spirit, in its vision. It includes every level of governance, federal, sub-federal. It includes large and small corporations. It includes a wide variety of experts on different issues, from logistics to workforce development and infrastructure. And basically, they keep their eye on the elements of competitiveness for this region, much wider lens than they do the minutia, but they also have a really wide vision. So the next 2 events with NASCO will be July 21st. That one is featuring Andrea Van Voot, Nadia Theodore, who is the Consul General for Canada to the Southeast, and Brenda Cordova. And I'm going to be moderating that one, so I hope you'll show up. We're going to discuss USMCA and how it can be leveraged to revive a smart North American policymaking process. So sorry, never had that happen. I had a call come through in the middle of that. Always a new thing with Zoom, isn't it? All right, so then on July 28th, we're going to widen the lens past the borders and look at North American logistics and some of the really interesting supply chain dynamics during the pandemic. So we're going to cover things like disaster aid relief and what is happening with e-commerce delivery, since the demand for that is through the roof, and trucking issues. And that's going to include Kathy Fulton, Alma Azevedo, and Allison Gifford, who is with UPS Canada. Tiffany Melvin from NASCO is going to moderate that. So these are all going to be tremendous panels. It has to be said that you will notice we had no difficulty whatsoever finding women to speak on all 3 of these panels who are expert, who have reached the heights of their fields, and we're so grateful to them for participating. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Rachel Connell from NASCO to actually introduce the members of this panel. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks to our panelists. Unmute yourself, Rachel.
There we go. Thank you, Andrea. We're so happy to have this partnership with you all, with WIT. You've become a great friend to NASCO over the years, and we certainly appreciate that. For those of you that may not be as familiar with NASCO, feel free to check out our website, nasconetwork.com. Andrea shared that we are a North American trade and supply chain organization. We have a lot of spirit, a lot of spunk from members across the US, Canada, and Mexico. We have several of our just fantastic women that are a part of our NASCO network that are gathered here today. And I want to quickly run through and introduce them. So we have Dr. Lori Troutman, who is engaged in a range of activities focused on the US-Canada border, particularly in the Washington and British Columbia region. So she's out west. Lori Troutman, give us a wave here. Okay, there's Lori, and she's involved in many of the border working groups. She's a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So she's no slouch. Then we have Marta Leardy Anderson, who has over 20 years of experience providing strategic policy and operational advice at the Detroit-Windsor border. She's led a lot of large-scale projects and innovative initiatives. She currently works with the Cross-Border Institute at the University of Windsor. I don't know if you all can see Marta, but if you scroll to the second screen, she's right there at the top. Lovely lady there. Then we have Lori Tanous, who is right under Marta. Lori, give us a wave. Lori provides public policy counsel to government officials and industry leaders on border security and management. She is involved with Canadian trade and immigration law. Lori wears 10 different hats, so it's just a matter of what day it is to figure out which hat she has on. She's also involved in helping combat human trafficking at the border, which I think is just a huge, huge need that we all see in our industry. So thank you for your work there, Lori. And then last but not least, we have Catherine Friedman. Catherine, let's see, give us a wave. There you are, you're on page 1 here. Catherine is a research associate professor of law and planning at the University of Buffalo. She's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Canada Institute. So we have a lot of knowledge on the US-Canada border here with us today. And I'm gonna introduce and turn things over to my colleague, Jennifer Fox. Jennifer is our Vice President of International Trade Policy and Canada Relations at NASCO. But you know what, before I do that really quick, let me introduce, there's Tiffany Melvin. She's our President of NASCO, our fearless leader-in-chief. Give us a wave, Tiffany. There she is. I just wanted to introduce her real quick. But Jennifer Fox just has a wealth of 15 years plus of industry experience, supply chain and logistics. She serves as our NASCO Canadian point person on really all things related to cross-border trade. She's a prominent educator on policies and recommendations to achieve a more efficient US-Canada border. So we're excited to have her moderate this discussion with us. Unfortunately, her camera is not working, so you're not going to see her face, but she is on the line with us, and you should hear her voice clearly. So you can just look at my face and listen to Jen. Okay, with that, Jen, take it away.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for volunteering your beautiful face for me. Sorry, everyone, my computer, this is a terrible excuse, but my computer is literally older than time itself. So I don't know, I've been having some technical issues for quite some time, and going to Staples to try and purchase a computer in the middle of COVID has just not been on the list of my priorities, but I'm thinking maybe it should be. So bear with me, and we'll get started. So we have this great panel. Thanks so much to our panelists for being here today, and Andrea and Rachel for putting this together. I guess we'd like to get started. We're going to move from the West Coast to the East Coast for all of our questions, just to keep the flow moving. So we'll start with Lori Troutman. We'll move to Lori Tanous and Marta, and then Catherine. And I'm going to start with question number 1 for our panelists. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is happening in your region at the border now?
Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for having me, both WIT and NASCO. You are definitely a feisty group of ladies that are very fun to work with, and it's a pleasure to serve as your colleague. So out here in the Pacific Northwest region, which is really Western British Columbia, Western Washington State, I think we've seen some similar trends in regards to the border restrictions as other regions. We saw trade dropped by about 20 to 25% in April, and it started to come up a little bit. So right now in our region, cross-border trade is about 14% of normal, or 86% of normal, about a 14% decrease. And the goods that move through our ports are very different from the goods that move through, say, the Detroit-Windsor region. We have a lot of mixed loads in our region. We don't have kind of that single shipper automobile industry where you have the same sort of goods moving back and forth in a large way. And we have a lot of agricultural commodities as well. So what's interesting is though, even though we've seen our truck volumes decline by about 20%, the trade value has declined even more. So we've seen trade value between BC and Washington in this region moving through our ports decline by about 26%. Now, I don't think that that's a result of the border restrictions. I think that's just simply a result of decreased demand, partially because we did see a dip in April and it is starting to come back up now. So I think from the perspective of simply the border restrictions that trade is moving pretty well back and forth. Now, in terms of passenger vehicle travel, that's a totally different story. In our region, we've seen a decline of about 98%. We are the busiest cross-border region for passenger travel if you look at the collection of ports that cross between Western BC and Western Washington. But what distinguishes us from especially Detroit, Windsor region, but also Buffalo, Niagara region, is that about 70 to 75% of the people crossing through our ports are Canadian. So we're very dominated by Canadian cross-border travelers, and about 3/4 of those Canadians are crossing purely for discretionary purposes. So that tends to be tourism, recreation, a lot of cross-border shopping in our region. We only have about 1 or 2% of the people moving back and forth crossing for work. So as a result, we have seen those border restrictions, which of course are limited only to essential travel, really almost bring our cross-border movement to a halt. And that started to change a little bit in the last few weeks. We actually are seeing few more people moving back and forth, almost about a 50% increase, but it was so low before that the numbers are still low. And one thing I'll mention before I pass it on, because I know we're tight on time, is that we also have what I call the curious case of Point Roberts, which is this little bit of land that is cut off by the 49th parallel and basically landlocked by Canada. So those people in Point Roberts can't actually get to the United States very easily now, even though they are US residents. So that's been a really quirky thing that we've had to try to figure out how to manage in our region. And I know there's a couple other examples in other places along the US-Canada region where these border restrictions are having some unpredictable or sort of unanticipated consequences and impacts. So I'll leave it at that and let you move east.
Thanks, Lori. So maybe we can turn it over to Lori Tanus.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to NASCO and to WIT for having me here today, and thank you to all the participants. So much like Lori said, here at the Windsor-Detroit border, we are experiencing unprecedented times in terms of what we're seeing at the border. Opposite to what Lori described, the majority of the people that do cross our border do cross for work. We have a significant number of Canadian nurses, Canadian engineers, architects, a variety of different professions who work in Michigan. And so initially with the restrictions, there was concern as to whether they were able to cross, were not able to cross. We also have a number of people who don't have work permits but cross the border daily for meetings and for their business travelers, and they may not have work permits. So it's this grouping of individuals who are really struggling in terms of their ability to get into the US and vice versa. So Americans who work in Canada in various professions or who need to come to Canada for meetings as part of their work. Our border in Windsor-Detroit is very integrated. It's like a spider web. So it's not as simple as, well, that's the US and this is Canada, much like all trade. Speaking of trade, that has been moving smoothly. We've not really seen any issues in terms of the movement of goods across the border during these border restrictions. I think probably daily since this pandemic has begun, I've been receiving calls from individuals who are stuck in one side of the border or the other and unable to either go to see their family members or take care of property that they have or even do their discretionary travel. So we're seeing significant changes and we're sort of going with the punches on a daily basis and doing our best just to manage what's happening given the times we're in right now.
Thanks, Lori. Maybe I could ask Marta if you want to add to that.
Just to add, and thank you again to NASCO and to WIT for hosting us today. To the point that Lori made with the trade, we had seen that the value of the trade between the Windsor-Detroit corridor had also been increasing over the past little while, and as Lori said, that has continued. The trade is getting through. But when we say that, I just want to add a bit of a caveat, because it's the big traders that are trading. It's the automotive folks that are moving their products. It's the big ag folks. And I would even add the pharmaceutical companies are able to move. But we're hearing anecdotal at this point, but anecdotal evidence that the medium size and certainly the smaller size traders are really suffering. They're not able to build out their networks. They're not able to easily move their merchandise or their services. So we're seeing that there is going to, what we think, and we'll see it, hopefully get a better picture of it as we see the data come in. But it's the small and medium-sized businesses that are suffering at this point.
Thanks, Marta. That's not surprising to hear, but it is unfortunate. Catherine, maybe we can move to you now.
Hi there. Well, again, thank you to WIT and NASCO for inviting me to participate with my esteemed colleagues. I very much appreciate it. The story in Buffalo, Niagara, Toronto is similar to what we've heard from my panelists in the other region. Trade, for the most part, has been moving fairly smoothly. There is roughly a 15% decline in commercial traffic at the bridges in our area. We attributed that to not so much supply chain disruptions, but either a decrease in demand, or perhaps, as Marta suggested, issues with small to medium-sized enterprises getting or remaining engaged in the trade relationship. We have seen a steep decline in passenger traffic, a 98% drop in passenger traffic at all of the bridges in our region. We don't have as many folks crossing the border for work as Detroit Windsor. We do have more, I suspect, than the Pacific Northwest, but not as much as Detroit Windsor. We do have a lot of cross-border passenger travelers here in the region, Canadians coming down to Buffalo, Niagara to shop. We also have a very, very strong tourism economy, all of which have dried up in the current environment. Buses across the Canada-US border crossings in our region have dried up. I mean, it's not even dropped 98% or 99%. It's 100% drop in bus transportation, which gets to the tourism industry. As you may be aware, those of you on the call may be aware, Buffalo, Niagara, St. Catharines, Toronto is home to Niagara Falls, New York, Niagara Falls, Ontario, and the tourism economy has been decimated. Tourism officials have been quite frank about that. So that's the picture in my neck of the woods.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to all the panelists. That's obviously, I think we're all very much aware, and we're sort of expecting not really good news story. And as somebody who likes to at least once a year cross the border into Buffalo and go see a Bills game, this is not looking very good for my vacation time come September, October football season. So anyway, okay, moving on. Thanks again so much for those comments. How does the current status of the border in your region affect border policy moving forward? And we'll start with you, Lori Troutman.
Thanks, Jen. This is such an interesting question, and I think it's fascinating that we have this regional expertise because, border policy is a federal jurisdiction, of course, but it plays out differently in different regions. And I do think there's a lot to be said for how different regions are impacted differently in these scenarios, whether it was post 9/11 or it's the current border restrictions that we're facing. So I think in our region, there's been a real obvious urgent need to be innovative and creative in how we can approach border policy and be able to incorporate what I think of as a third leg in at least US perspective of border policy, which post 9/11 had been really, how do we incorporate security and efficiency? Well, now we've got security, efficiency, and public health. So how can we incorporate that into the way we manage our border? And I'm sure everyone on the call is involved in some of similar conversations around proposing different pilot projects, which we can maybe talk about later. But I would highlight in our region, we have a very strong cross-border institutional fabric. So that's not only what I would describe as a similar identity between Western BC and Western Washington, but also a number of really strong initiatives that really support that cross-border communication. And our governor and our premier have an excellent relationship, and I know that they were actually in conversation regarding the border restrictions and Canada's Quarantine Act and BC's quarantine restrictions. So I think there's a lot of engagement, there's a lot of focus, and whether or not that's about designing specific ways we need to approach managing the border, or just continuing this dialogue around how private sector is impacted by these restrictions, how families are impacted by these restrictions, and connecting those different conversations to make sure that we're addressing these issues as they're playing out.
If I could, before we move on, I'd just like to tack sort of a Part B question onto that, because you mentioned, border policy is a federal issue. Do you see, and I'll ask all the panelists the same sort of Part B question, and sorry for the impromptu, but do you see a need for there to be discussions more at a local, regional level in terms of border policy as a result of the differences between what's happening in Canada, what's happening in the States, and what's happening from province to state?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting question that I've thought about a lot, because Kate and I and Bill Anderson have worked on kind of these regional analyses of the Canada-US border, because those of us who work in this space, we know how regional these issues are. And we're always sort of butting up against the federal jurisdiction. And while I do think that a lot of times the local port directors and the local agencies have the best knowledge about what works at the border, I think that the COVID-19 situation and the border restrictions may really require that federal jurisdiction to take precedence. It's an evolving situation, but I know that from the US perspective, it's not clear if the Department of Homeland Security or Customs and Border Protection actually could take a regional approach to lifting the restrictions or reopening the border. You have even things as mundane as staffing issues and unions to consider. So it gets a little technical and complex, and while it seems like anything's possible these days, I do think that taking too much of a regional approach might not work, given that we're working with federal agencies and federal jurisdiction.
Okay, thanks, Lori. So maybe we can move to Lori Tenus for your thoughts on that.
Certainly. So I would echo Lori Troutman's comments in terms of, since 9/11, we really haven't been challenged this way in terms of how to address border policy. And we did at that time with the implementation of Trusted Traveler for commercial travel and for passenger travel, with things like Nexus, with things like CTPAT and FAST. So we were able to implement, I think, this approach that generally worked and had everyone's buy-in. I think the difference is now is that in this case, because the issues that we're seeing are of a public health matter, and I was a former CBSA officer for 7 years before I became an attorney. I can tell you, we don't, they don't, and there's no expertise there in a public health forum, right? So we would need to be in a collaborative working relationship with the experts, epidemiologists, doctors, people who understand this pandemic and how to try and prevent it. So I think in that sense, we're going to see a combination of different things that we've not seen before, but we can certainly, and I do think that we should be using the skills and the knowledge that we have from 9/11 and other events at the border to help us going forward. In terms of the Part B of your question, again, I would concur with Lori Troutman as much as there are differences from a regional perspective, as we just heard. At our border in Windsor, Detroit, we see a lot of business and employment type travel. We also see tourism and other types of travel, but that really dominates from the passenger side of things. But from a legal perspective, because in Canada and in the United States, just in the case of immigration law is federal in both countries. So, beyond the other issues, those jurisdictional issues, those federal jurisdictional issues would take precedence. I think one way that we could do it is have consultations, so with stakeholders, to understand the nuances that vary from region to region, and then roll that into to those discussions to then have a better, clearer type of policy that would, enable the movement of people and goods efficiently.
Great points. Thank you, Lori. Marta?
Jennifer, I would just add that although this has been such a difficult situation with regard to what to do with the border. We have had events in the past that have impacted the border and the way it functions. So both Lori both Loris, I should say, have spoken about the 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, you saw a great coming together of experts in different levels of government, especially on the federal level on both sides of the border, to try to take a look at how we could function in a new world where security was the prime motivating factor for everything that happened at the border. Now, as Lori said, we add efficient. We always thought about an efficient border. We needed a secure border. Now we're looking at the public health dynamic that happens. I would, from a policy perspective, I'm encouraged that we have put into place the trusted trader programs, the trusted traveler programs, and not forget that even prior to the COVID shutting down our borders, we still have government agencies that deal with disease type questions every day, and that's usually on our side, Agriculture Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection agencies. So we're not looking at something with totally naive eyes and never having seen anything like this before, having dealt with it before. And even before that, we had SARS, and even before that. We just have to find a better combination of perhaps existing programs, how to leverage these excellent existing programs that people have put, and I would say the experts and government officials alike have dedicated a lot of time and expertise to developing, and a lot of hours bringing together the stakeholder groups and getting from them what it is that could work and not work. Hey, it's not perfect, but I do think that as we go forward, we have a lot of great examples of what we could leverage. Introducing technology and the advancement of some great things that we're hearing through our colleagues at the University of Windsor, and with regard to a lot of the funds that the federal government and the government of Ontario have put into rapidly pushing through some incredibly innovative thinking around the detection of COVID-19, but not exclusively the detection of COVID-19 at land border crossings and at other ports of entry. I think if we could, bring more of that together in a more efficient manner, I think we could get to what Lori was saying. Now we have to bring the security, the efficiency, and the public health lenses together and come up with some really rock and roll border policy. Sorry, it went a little bit too long, but I thought that was a great question.
No, that's fine. That's great, actually. Thank you for the comments. And honestly, I couldn't agree more with respect to the comment that you made about leveraging technology. And there are a lot of opportunities for sure. Catherine, I'll turn it over to you now to answer the same question.
Sure. Before I answer the question, though, I just want to go back to something that you said, Jennifer, at the end of our first question about coming over to Buffalo to watch the Bills. And it reminded me that the situation is, not pleasant and not particularly positive, but all is not lost. There are conversations. There's nothing definite, but there are conversations about having the Toronto Blue Jays play 60 games at the baseball stadium in Buffalo, New York, because US teams can't get over the border. And they can't get over to play, so they're thinking very creatively. It's certainly not definite, but there apparently are conversations at the highest levels taking place where the Blue Jays may come down and play in Buffalo so that they are able to play in Major League Baseball. So
wouldn't that mean though that no Canadians can come watch our team?
I know it would be sort of perverse, right? But it's, it would offset some of the millions of dollars that have been lost in tax revenue, right, from the tourism and shopping industries. So that being said, moving forward, so there have been a couple of conversations in our region where we actually have convened stakeholders in the trenches to get the perspectives on how we could responsibly lift or ease restrictions that are currently in place at the border. And we sent the recommendations that came out of our first stakeholder meeting to our congressional delegation, to leadership in the Northern Border Caucus, which some of you may know is being led by Brian Higgins, who's from Western New York, and Elise Cusack, who is from up in the upstate New York, Plattsburgh area. So some of the recommendations included asking federal officials to consider perhaps a more regional approach. I'm not as convinced as others that that won't work, but I think we are all well aware of the fact that a one size fits all approach across the border may not work given the very different makeup of the different ports of entry. I'll leave it at that. We had recommended that the United States and Canada re-energize the Regulatory Cooperation Council to reduce unnecessary regulatory differences with regard to medical supplies. We had encouraged that both Canada and the United States incorporate exceptions into whether it's by American legislation or by Canadian legislation, that they incorporate Canadian and then American exceptions into that legislation, absolutely understanding that in very difficult economic times, protectionist sentiments tend to rise to the top, but and I get the politics, and I think a lot of the stakeholders get the politics of trade, but by the same token, we also understand that at the end of the day, particularly with regard to the Canada-US relationship, such protectionist sentiments really end up hurting. So for example, with Buy American provisions, there are a lot of companies that are integrally tied to Canada with regard to their supply chains, and U.S. workers end up actually getting hurt. So it's a sort of perverse consequence. Absolutely echo the investment needed in border technology, biometrics, artificial intelligence, and something that is, I think, very simple, and I've said this in a number of other calls, one solution or one piece of a solution to lifting restrictions, in my view, is Nexus. It represents touchless technology, and we already have one piece of the puzzle already in place. And so having CBP and CBSA market Nexus more broadly, having more people get Nexus, I think would serve fluidity at the border quite well. The problem in New York is that currently the governor and DHS are having a little spat, and New Yorkers are not allowed to renew their Nexus cards or their global entry cards in general, and New Yorkers cannot newly apply for a Nexus card, so that's a little problematic. But those are just some of the policy recommendations that stakeholders here made to officials at DHS, CBSA, CBP, and again, the congressional delegation on our side of the border, members of parliament and provincial parliament in Canada.
Thanks, Catherine. That was great. And that, I think, sets us up nicely to move to our next question, which is specifically about collaboration. And what are your thoughts in terms of how we can continue to collaborate, and does collaboration change in light of the new reality?
Well, I think that there's no question about continued collaboration. At least in my region, the groundwork had been laid really strongly after 9/11 to create these institutions and these initiatives, and they're still very active. And it's what's interesting about cross-border collaboration is we can think about it at the US kind of federal, Canadian federal scales, or we could think about it as what happens on the ground. And the ethos out here in the Cascadia sort of Pacific Northwest region has always been that if we leave it to the people in Ottawa and DC, they're gonna mess it up. So we have to sort of take it upon ourselves to have this engagement and this dialogue and continue to work on these situations and these problems that eventually do filter up, of course, to the national policy scale. So I think collaboration is going to be key moving forward, and I do really see this time as kind of that next iteration, huge iteration of border policy, not unlike what we saw after 9/11, where there's going to be a huge continued or a huge renewed focus on the border that really kind of dropped out for a while there. I mean, we had the Beyond the Border Accord, we had some continuing initiatives. Out here, we were working a lot on implementing pre-clearance, expanding our Nexus program, and kind of taking those bits from the last policy collaboration and continuing to implement them. Well, now it's become really clear that that re-engagement needs to happen across scales as well, because at the federal scale, between Washington and Ottawa is really kind of fallen out of the bottom. And it's a little bit clear, I think, right now in the way that these border extensions are simply being announced without much strategic planning around them or much stakeholder engagement, that dialogue has really weakened considerably.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Lori. Lori?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with Lori. You know, in recent years, we saw the implementation, which was a follow-up from the Beyond the Border discussions of the Safe Food for Canada Act and the FSMA on the US side. And that was an example of Canada and US in a certain industry working together in a successful way. And so I think, you know, now is definitely the time for us to move the needle and try and, you know, try and just determine how we're going to go forward from here. I think, again, I would echo Lori's comments as somebody that lives and breathes the border every single day. I'm physically there many times, and so I'm seeing things that perhaps at different levels others may not see. And those announcements that come out, I don't think that you know, sort of a fallout of them are really being escalated or cascaded up in terms of understanding what really is happening. And although I understand that the necessity of them, I think we also have to ask ourselves, you know, what's going to happen in 6 months from now, and what is the collateral damage going to be like, and how are we going to handle that and deal with that? So the collaboration is necessary now to figure out, I think, a path forward, but then we need the right people in place who are going to be able to understand how to pick up the pieces, because there is going to be damage from having these restrictions in as long as they have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Marta, do you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, just very quickly, Jennifer, this idea about how does the collaboration change going forward, I think is interesting. I think we've gone from a place where a lot of people may have thought we were moving to more open borders, like the Schengen approach in Europe. And then when we see, whether it's because of immigration type issues or a pandemic, we see that borders go up very quickly. And Lori commented that these decisions are made very quickly and with very little or no collaboration with stakeholders, or even, you know, pick up the phone and let somebody know what you're doing. I think there's an opportunity to change that. And again, going back to 9/11, very clearly, there was the desire to bring different groups together and different experts together. I think we have to remember those best practices. What got us over the 9/11 hump and got us to a place where we were collaborating and discussing and coming up with solutions, coming up with real agreements, coming up with actions that brought us forward. And I think we need to re-energize the collaborative networks that we have. I know at the Cross Border Institute, we, as Lori said, Dr. Anderson, who's the director, we try to do a lot of work across with our different colleagues across the border, but also north and south. So collaborating with institutes in Mexico and across the United States, and learning how to communicate to decision makers and providing them with the key pieces of information they require in order to make better decisions with regard to how goods and people, services and funds move across international borders, so that their decisions do not become additional barriers, but that they do contribute to what Lori had pointed out was one of the 3 concerns that we have, and that is an efficient border. And that would include, Jennifer, our chambers of commerce. Here in the Windsor-Detroit area, they collaborate. The Windsor-Detroit Chamber collaborate very closely. We have the Canada-US Business Association, CUSBA, that is a great organization that helps us. It's a forum to discuss cross-border activity. So all of these things knitting together. And the good news is that we've already done it. We've already been there. So it's not that we have to recreate things. It's just doing more of the things that work well.
That's great. Thanks, Marta. And it actually brings to mind, some potential necessary collaboration between the public health agencies and the government departments that regulate the border. Because generally in the past, they've not had to communicate. And I think more than ever, those 2 departments, department to department, are going to have to start talking to each other. Catherine, I'll turn it over to you to answer the same question, please.
So I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I'll actually take it out one level, maybe the highest level, something I've been really thinking about over the last few days. How does collaboration change in light of this new reality? I wonder if, from a foreign policy perspective, if the United States perhaps had treated our Canadian friends, neighbors, long-standing ally, perhaps a little bit better over the last 3.5 to 4 years, not imposing tariffs, having issues, but managing them in a diplomatic way behind the scene, not threatening to put troops on the border. I wonder if Canadian sentiment toward the United States would be a little different. I wonder if the average Canadian in the street is just plain tired of being treated the way that the United States has treated Canada diplomatically over the last 3.5 years. So, that being said, I think that it really puts a point on what my colleagues have said about the deep need for folks like us and other stakeholders on the ground, in the trenches, folks like NASCO, folks like WIT, to really keep those channels of communication and diplomacy and collaboration open. I think that's critically important.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to just step off script here because we did get a question that came in from one of our listeners in the chat box. So again, we'll keep the same order, but I'm just going to ask the question. Could the panelists comment on the Future Borders Coalition, co-chaired by Jerry Bruno, YVR, and Matt Morrison of PNWER? They have recently struck a border recovery working group to provide advice to both federal governments. As a binational group of key business and public bodies, seems like a good vehicle at this critical time. And I will have something to say about that at the end, but I think I'll start, Lori, with you on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I saw that in the chat and I was gonna try to address it regardless. So this is a great collaboration. This was formed actually several years ago as the Beyond Preclearance Initiative, with the concept that we can bring private sector and government together and really push that next agenda of US-Canada border policy, which, as we talked about previously, has just really been languishing since the Beyond the Border Accord was sort of struck by Obama and Harper, and then both the new governments in Canada and the US haven't reached a new deal. And so this started out as a group to look at a broad range of border policies across modes, and then when COVID-19 hit and the border restrictions were put in place, Jerry Bruno at YVR and Matt Morrison at PNWER really pivoted quite quickly and refocused the group renamed it the Future Borders Coalition, which had already been kind of needing a new name from just pre-clearance focus. And so now there's specific working groups that are really all very focused on border recovery and how do we recover from what's happening at the border now. Jennifer and I are both involved in the land border working group. There is also an air mode, I believe, working group, and then a supply chains or sort of logistics working group. And this is a great form of collaboration because it involves, as I mentioned, private sector stakeholders, but also government at very high levels. And it has a lot of buy-in in both Ottawa and DC. So this group is really taking a lot of the expertise that's in this room and that on the ground knowledge about pilot projects, about what's happening at the border, and sort of translating it into some actionable items along with a lot of advocacy. So my institute, the institute that I direct, Border Policy Research Institute, we're just a small institute way in the northwest corner of the United States, and we conduct a lot of research, but that advocacy piece of connecting that research to the decision makers really requires these larger collaborations. And so I'm glad that the listener brought this up because it is a great example of collaboration across the scales and across sectors.
Thanks, Lori. Lori Tanous?
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add than what Lori just described. I'm familiar with the group and definitely agree that I think it's a great cross section of a variety of organizations, agencies, individuals, institutes that can work together and make some positive change.
Marta, anything to add?
Nothing at all, Jennifer. I think it's a great forum.
Okay, thank you. Catherine?
Ditto. Love Jerry Bruno. He's doing great work. He does great work.
Okay, so maybe I just quickly add, this is Jennifer, and NASCO, in my capacity with NASCO, I am actually a vice chair on the executive committee and a board member of the Future Borders Coalition. So personally think that the work that they're doing is fantastic. Yes, as Lori mentioned, I am a co-chair with her on the Border Recovery Working Group aimed at land border mode, and also co-chair on the Short-Term Policy Recommendations Working Group through the Future Borders Coalition. So the work that they're doing is really important. And we recently actually at the Future Borders Coalition have developed, with Lori Troutman's help and the members of the coalition, we have developed a list of recommendations that will be provided to the federal governments in Canada and the United States to help frame their decision making in terms of their approach to reopening the border, things that they should be thinking about before they sort of forge ahead with a reopening. So I imagine that will be publicly available very soon, but right now it's still in draft form, and we're hoping to get it into the hands of the federal governments very soon this week. So so look for that. I'm sure you'll see it circulating, and if you're on NASCO's mailing list, you'll likely get a copy of it. And if you're not on NASCO's mailing list, well, then you should be. So send us an email and we will add you. I see Rachel smiling at my shameless plug. Okay, so let's move on. Just a quick comment here I want to address from Lois McNabb. When I was a provincial public servant, we had to work behind the scenes to maintain relationships with public servants within Canada and the US. And I think that's a very significant comment to make. And I would hope that, you know, we can continue to encourage our provincial and state partners to work together at those levels. Okay, so back to our questions, and please, audience, feel free.
Then real quick, Gustavo de la Fuente from the San Diego-Tijuana border. Did you see his question?
No, sorry, I missed that.
That's okay. So Gustavo asks, can we learn more about what the University of Windsor is doing with regard to border technology?
Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome. Oh, Marta, unmute yourself.
Talking to myself. Thank you for that question. At the Cross Border Institute, we're looking at, you know, we have this philosophy that a lot of the technology that's already in place could be very, very useful if you use it in innovative ways. So we're working with Transport Canada on disruptive types of approaches to technology when it comes to cross-border movement of commercial vehicles. We're working with machine learning and artificial intelligence on a continuous risk assessment platform, and we're doing that with the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA. We're working with Scotiabank, one of the 5 major banks here in Canada, on blockchain and also artificial intelligence when it comes to streamlining the movement of funds across international borders. We are also working, and this is brand new, with a colleague at the University of Windsor who's using transmitters for, not using them, but developing transmitters, and working with the biochemistry folks across the country on detection of different types of viruses and other things, and figuring out ways how we put, as I said earlier, how do we use technology in perhaps a process that would then not interfere with the efficiency of processing commercial and other vehicles at land border crossings, but could help us in this overall risk assessment that is not only security oriented, but now brings into it the public health spectrum as well. So I hope that helps answer some of the question.
Thank you so much for that, Marta. I really appreciate it. Just while we're on the subject of Windsor and also being cognizant of time, I wanted to give a shout out to Heather Grondin, who's on the line. And just Heather, I wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to jump in here and give us an update. Heather is with the Gordie Howe Bridge Authority. So Heather, happy to have you on the line. Maybe you could give us a quick update on what's happening.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And thanks. This has been a very interesting panel. I think the discussion about collaboration is really reflected in the Gordie Howe International Bridge Project, where you see the collaboration between government and government agencies. Construction is continuing on the Gordie Howe International Bridge. We've been very fortunate during COVID-19. Our constructors have put in a number of precautions at our construction sites that have been allowing them to continue to work throughout this period, with construction progressing both on the Canadian and US sides of the project. This work has been able for us to be able to progress, continuing toward our 2024 end date, and continuing to keep people both in the Windsor and Detroit region employed throughout COVID-19. I'll also note that, again, on that theme of collaboration that's been brought up, we've been able to collaborate very closely with the border agencies, both in Canada and the US, to allow some of our essential workers to continue to cross despite border closures. And that's been really, very beneficial to the project itself. And only through collaboration and working closely and identifying the important need behind this have we been able to continue to have those workers cross the border to continue to move the project forward. So that's just a general update. If people are looking for more details, certainly invite you to visit the website, GordieHoweInternationalBridge.com, and ask us any questions that you might have. So thank you for that opportunity, Jennifer.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Heather. And it's great to see your face. It's been a long time. Okay, so I know we're running short on time, but I do want to see how quickly we can blast through 2 questions. I'm going to roll them into one, and I know all of these ladies are awesome, so I'm sure we can get through to them before we wrap up. So my first question is going to be about current pilot projects that are happening in your area. What is it that you're aware of, and do the priority of those pilot projects change at all in light of COVID? And then the part 2 is, if you had to give one piece of career advice to someone on the line who's interested in, getting involved more with a trade or border security or border policy field, what would that piece of advice be? So fire away, Lori.
Oh, those are 2 very different questions, Jen. I'll say very briefly that the main pilot project that's really looks like it's moving forward in our region is the Health Pre-Clearance Pilot Project at Vancouver International Airport. That is really part of this Future Borders Coalition effort. And that's been pretty developed. It hasn't been tested yet. A lot of that depends on testing, but the general concept is that YVR, if they can run a pilot, and everybody, before they even clear security, everybody who arrives at the airport has to take a COVID test, and it would be a rapid response test. So theoretically, in a 60 to 90 minute window, you would have your test results so that anybody who is in the actual boarding area for the flight is proven to be COVID-19 negative, which creates a very safe environment in the air mode. Now, there's a lot of logistics around that, but it's definitely gaining some traction. And I think it's kind of taking that risk management approach with a health pre-clearance aspect that we're going to have to start taking at other border modes as well. And then the second part of your question, I don't know that I can recommend a path. I'm going to guess that all of us panelists here today took very different paths to get to where we ended up. But I would say to anybody who's interested in the Canada-US border space to really encourage you to become involved, because it's not a huge playing field. I always sort of think about the US-Mexico border world as being a little bit overwhelming because there's so many people and so many different initiatives and organizations involved. And on the US-Canada border, it's a pretty lean group of entities that are engaged, and certainly there's a demand for more energy to be put towards these issues.
Thanks, Lori. Lori Tanous?
In terms of a project that was happening prior to COVID that I think really makes sense is the contactless approach that CBSA and the Ambassador Bridge were taking in terms of having the e-gate. So where either on the commercial side or on the passenger side, you've got drivers coming through and are not having to have that face-to-face interaction with officers. Those officers are at a command point inside or in Ottawa. And obviously those are for trusted travelers, trusted commercial and passengers. So I think that kind of pilot project that has been implemented on the commercial side with certain carriers, and then there was 3 Nexus lanes. Obviously this was before the border restrictions, but those types of things, having that ability to not have to have that face-to-face, I think, post-COVID will definitely be helpful. And I think we could explore how we could do that more across the board. So to the second question, I think for me, having been in this, border world for the last 20 years, if I had to give somebody one piece of advice, I would say get as much hands-on experience as you can. So being able to be a practitioner has allowed me the ability to have other kinds of discussions, whether it's about policy or take what we've learned here and take those lessons and apply them at other borders. So I think just having as much hands-on experience, whether that's on the customs side or the immigration or both, has really been beneficial to me.
Thanks, Lori. Marta?
The program that Lori mentioned, and we fondly refer to it as the Green Lane program, is the pilot project here at Windsor Detroit that was promising. It looked very promising before COVID-19. With regard to the second question, Jennifer, I would encourage folks, especially young women, to because from my perspective in the last 20 plus years in this field, whether it's transportation, infrastructure, borders, supply chains, there's still a lot of space for folks to enter. That border issues, international trade, infrastructure, supply chains, transportation, they touch a lot of different areas of our lives. And if you're looking from a government perspective, it would include the public safety, and on the Canadian side, public safety, Transport Canada, Infrastructure Canada, Global Affairs, International Trade, Ag Canada, CFIA, at the provincial government levels as well. So if you just take a look at the government side of what's involved in managing borders and everything that affects it, it's really, really diverse, and there's lots of opportunity. So I would say entering any one of those fields would really lend itself to a career in dealing with borders and anything that affects borders.
Great, thank you, Marta. Catherine?
So our region is a nice little laboratory for pilot projects when it comes to the border and the Canada-US relationship. And the Peace Bridge Authority, actually it's technically the Public Bridge Authority, but the Peace Bridge Authority where Ron Reines is the CEO, the manager. They have a lot of there's a lot of creativity there, a lot of good relationships with local stakeholders as well as folks down in DC and Ottawa. So they currently have some interesting projects going on with regard to biometrics and facial recognition that I haven't heard have been suspended. So in my view, those sorts of pilot projects become even more important in the current environment. There's also a pilot project here that it's a collaboration between Brock University and the University of Buffalo to build out capacity for dealing with Canada-US border issues, policy issues, et cetera. So both of the, whether it's, biometrics, at the bridge or organizational capacity building, both I think should be built out in the next couple of years. So what advice would I give to people interested in this space? I agree with Lori Tenu's hands-on practical experience, practical training is really important. I know that friends of mine and colleagues in the logistics industry constantly beat the drum about the really awesome jobs that are available in that industry that just fly below the radar screen at the average college or university because there isn't a natural funnel. I would essentially say take courses and if you're still in school, take courses and get experience that provides you with a facility in a couple of different areas. Your ability to think broadly and critically and approach any problem that comes down the pike, I think will serve you very, very well. So I would be a broad, big thinker as opposed to that wicked specialist in one area.
Okay, thank you so much. All great advice, ladies. And thank you so, I know we're 3 minutes over, so I just want to do a quick wrap up and a huge shout out. You guys are awesome, ladies. So much knowledge and experience here with this panel. I loved it. I really enjoyed all of the information that we covered off here today. I hope everyone else on the panel, all the participants feel the same way. So sorry, I'm trying to rush because I know that we only scheduled to go till 3 p.m. Eastern time, and I see Rachel is ready to jump in. So I will just once again say thank you so much to our panelists, and I'll turn it over to you, Rachel, to wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you, Jen, and thank you to all of our speakers again. This was wonderful. We really appreciate being able to partner with WIT. This was great. We look forward to next week, Tuesday, July 21st, to our USMCA discussion. And then the following week, July 28th, we'll have our North American logistics in the face of a pandemic discussion. So please mark your calendars, plan to join us. These sessions are being recorded by WIT, and we will have them available. So either WIT or NASCO, one of us will send out a note to everyone who's registered. And Caitlin, do you want to be the official wrapper-upper?
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. I think everything has been said, so I'll just kind of echo and, thank everyone for joining us today, both the panelists, moderator, and of course, all the guests. Registration for next week's event and for the one thereafter are on the WIT website, open to WIT members, NASCO members, and the general public. So do check that out. So with that, I'm going to wish everybody a good rest of your afternoon and see you all next week.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.